You're still watching Nigeria Decides, and tonight we are also talking about the task ahead of new governors. Like that of Lagos State, you have to govern no less than 20 million people, and that's quite a task. And joining us in the studio to talk about these and more, we have Said Hussaini. Good evening. And we also have Bugi Okwemoy. Gentlemen.
It's good to have you join us.
Delight to be with you.
All right, so of course, some votes are still being counted, and we're still waiting on those ones. But in the meantime, some governors have been re-elected, both sitting and new or incoming governors. Of course, the task ahead of them is one that remains to be seen. But let's start with Lagos, which is where we are. We know that Ambode was governor. He's the outgoing governor who's going to be handing over to someone who has said that he's been in the system. He might not have been a governor, but he's been working, within the government and has worked, side by side with the government. What do you think for Lagos, a state like Lagos, which is highly metropolitan, with businesses from outsiders, insiders, spread across? Where do you think a governor for Lagos State should start? I'll start with you, Hussein. Where do you think a governor should start?
Thanks. I think one of the things that you're going to see the incoming governor focus on is to try to clarify a very important debate that's been happening around the legitimacy of his candidacy. He has been accused of being a godson, in effect, right? It's been suggested that his candidacy has been supported by some very important power brokers behind the scenes, and that's how he's been able to emerge. I think for this incoming governor to be seen to be successful, he's going to have to show the citizenry what separates him from this godfather, right? He's going to have to show some level of independence. And I think there are a few important sectors that we have to focus on to see if this incoming governor is performing as an independent and technocratic manager. We're going to have to see some reform in the tax sector, right? We're going to have to see the resources that the Lagos state government is acquiring from its citizens. We're going to have to see those resources, particularly tax resources, put to very judicious use. We're going to have to see some very immediate, some quick wins, right? Lagos traffic is, of course, on the minds of citizens, but it's also on the minds of businesses. This is also a key chokehold on the Lagos economy, an economy that has a lot more potential than has been realized, right? And traffic is causing a gridlock.
A lot of people tell you they spend the better part of their lives in Lagos traffic. Literally, they spend 6 hours, 3 hours going, 3 hours coming. So you literally have taken out 6 hours of your day for traffic.
And this isn't just a concern for middle class people who are sitting in their ACs, right? This is a concern for people riding in Moluwes from Ujuduberga all the way to Banana Island, to do, a clerical work, right? So this is something that we have to see as a priority for any incoming governor who wants to leave a legacy that Lagosians will appreciate. We have to deal with garbage collection, which is, of course, a major issue that the outgoing governor struggled with. And, it's been suggested by a lot of very informed analysts that, in fact, part of the issue that led to his ouster ultimately was problems in his management of the business side of the garbage collection business. So all this to say that the incoming governor has to clarify how he's a new man, how he's his own independent person, and he has to do so through picking a number of strategic sectors, including taxation, transportation, and garbage collection.
For the incoming governor, let's use an Ambode. Word on the street is that he stepped on a few toes, and that's why he's been ousted. Now, that's word on the street. But how do you try to prove that you're not a puppet on the strings without, ruffling a few feathers or falling out of favor with the kingmaker, for example? Because he's saying he has to prove to us, the people. But how do you not make a mistake or ruffle feathers in a bid to do that? The question is for you.
Okay. Well, firstly, you have to separate politics from administration. And what we've seen in Lagos over the last couple of election cycles has been a situation where the political class, of course led by the godfather, as it were, ensures that when it's time to pick a candidate, they usually will pick somebody who's more like a technocrat. They usually don't pick politicians. So what we have in Lagos is a situation where the technocrat is expected to focus on the job of running Lagos as a city, running Lagos as a state. What I would think is, and in all reality, from what we've seen in house, it seems to be working when a technocrat is focused on. If you look at Fashola, if you look at Ambody, they really didn't have too much political issues to deal with. The focus was just get into office and let the party structure itself manage the political issues.
Okay, gentlemen, now let's take a few steps back and then look at how the elections went into choosing these new leaders and how the body language of the populace has been so far. We noticed that voter apathy was the main issue of the day. That was the language on everybody's mind. We recorded low turnout. In the previous presidential election that was conducted on February 23rd, it was pegged at about 35% thereabout, and everybody now is saying, well, possibly we should be looking at 20%, and that's very poor figures. If a student scores 35 initially and then drops to 20, it's a lot of concern there. So what do you think we should be doing this time around to ensure that voter apathy does not repeat itself? Let's look at INEC now doing the needful and all of the different political state actors as well doing the needful, but having in mind that Nigerians must come out and vote.
Well, I think it's important to clarify two things. First of all, I think when we're talking about voter turnout, the important figure is not the number of registered voters, but the number of voters that collected their PVCs, right? So it's turnout of voters who have already collected their PVCs. And there the numbers are slightly higher than you mentioned. Those who turned out last time were around upwards of 40%, and this time it was around 37%. So you're right on the wider trend, which is apathy, right? And so the question here is, how do we fix this apathy, and who's responsible for it, and what are the factors triggering it, right? And I think another thing to correct, another impression I think that has sort of wrongly set in, is that we should look primarily at our state institutions to sort of blame them for the demobilization of a large group of Nigerian voters. And of course, the state institutions haven't performed perfectly. They've had some lapses. But really, the key institutions that is their primary job to mobilize voters, the key institutions that exist to inspire voters, to connect to voters, to get them out to vote, are the political parties. So if voters are staying at home, if voters are uninspired, if voters don't believe in the alternatives that are presented to them, that is the fault of the political parties. And we have to think finally in our country about empowering or looking for political parties that actually present viable alternatives. And that will inspire, the 60-odd% of Nigerians who are of voting age, who collected their PVCs, and yet who, on the day of the election, saw nothing that could actually inspire their interests.
Did you anticipate that these political actors had a sense of awareness that their misconduct and the gimmicks they played, looking at ballot box snatching, the killings that happened, and the whole shake-up we had during the presidential election, did you think they thought in their mindset would have had so much of a ripple effect that even in areas where they thought they would have pulled stronger numbers, they didn't get that happen?
Well, let me start by saying, concerning these elections, in all honesty, it's really been disappointing. When we consider the gains we made with the 2015 elections in terms of organization, in terms of how the elections went, we expected that in 2019 we would have made a whole lot of progress. Unfortunately, we seem to have taken several steps back. We must understand the importance of elections to the electorate. I saw a picture on social media some days back where an elderly woman, probably she was incapacitated, I don't know, but somebody carried her on her back to the polling station and into the polling unit to cast her vote. Election period, election time is the only time that the citizen has a power to have a say in the country. So it's not something we should joke with.
So you're saying being nonchalant, it's not allowed?
Yeah, what I'm trying to lay firstly is several things. We should be concerned with the level of voter apathy that occurs. Now, to the build up to the election, let me also say, really, I was quite involved in this last election, so there's some information that we have. It is actually to the advantage of the dishonest politician that voters don't come out. Because when there's
who's telling the average voter that? How does the average voter get that information? Because you see, they say, well, we vote them, we don't vote them, we know who's going to be the, but because they don't have access to that information you just dropped, hence the reason why, no matter what it is, they'll never show up. We must know why they don't show up. And there are a lot of factors that lead to them not showing up. Firstly, the institutions responsible for the electoral process. We had several people, I cast my vote outside of Lagos State. We had several people in the build-up to the elections who said they went to INEC office to pick up their PVCs, and they were told their PVCs weren't ready. Some were told their PVCs hadn't been produced, even though we got some information that some politicians had a hand in ensuring that that happened. Before an election, you hear, stories of expected violence. You hear about rivers. You hear, anybody who picks ballot boxes. Even if you don't intend to take ballot boxes, you don't want to be there when a stray bullet meets you. Some politicians actually heat up the system, heat up the polity to try and discourage some voters from coming out. Dishonest politicians, like I said. A politician who's sure his crowd is going to vote obviously wants his crowd to come out. But the politician who knows in the build-up to the election, the truth is even before votes are cast, who wins is really already known. If you walk through the populace, you have an idea of what direction they are thinking in.
Whether or not to shake up the polity, now, in certain areas we see some slim margin where you would say ordinarily it's expected to be the stronghold of one political party, whether or not they're tired of the party or not. But if people came out en masse, we would have seen a better representation of the will of the people. Do you agree?
In all honesty, like I said, yes, results are coming out and they are being announced, but if you know what goes on the field, with the things I have seen and I've heard from several polling centers, like I said, I was keenly involved in these elections, some of these results are really not a true reflection of what was supposed to have happened or what happened. Between collation centers, a lot of magic happens. So it's difficult for me to really accept when I hear some results being announced and they say from this area. It's really difficult to accept. The strategy for most politicians is usually beef up the votes from your strongholds, reduce the votes from your opponent's strongholds. How you succeed in that now depends on how much influence you have, whether you're in government, whether you have access to the army, or whether you have. So some of these results are not really true reflections of what the will of the people usually would be.
Saeed, I'm just, some people, he's giving some reasons, but there are some people who hold the opinion that the reasons why they didn't really bother about this elections is because they were not necessarily satisfied with the presidential elections and how it turned out. So could this also be one of the reasons? Do you think, from where you're sitting, that this could have one way or the other influenced,
Talking about the will of the people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There are a variety of reasons why people in Nigeria fail to express their will. And he's named some of them. I wouldn't agree with everything my colleague has said, because I think it's important that we avoid falling into conspiracy theories when discussing Nigerian politics. Even if we stay within the realm of what we know, there's a lot we can do. Let's, I think, exclude the realm of rumor and conspiracy, just because that demobilizes us further, right? If we believe the system is rigged, we're going to stay home. And I think that's why a lot of people stay home, to be honest. But I think, and of course, there are certain inconveniences that particularly middle-class voters complain about. Oh, the lines are long, we're standing in the sun, there's some difficulty retrieving my PVC, etc. Sure, these inconveniences exist, but to voters who really have a stake in the democratic process, particularly those whose livelihoods are affected by who comes into office, these aren't the most primary concerns. It's middle-class voters, to be honest, that are often demobilized by the inconveniences of the process. Nonetheless, the process should be made more convenient so that more Nigerians can exercise their franchise. But the primary reason, I think, and the reason that Nigerians don't seem to be talking as much about why this level of apathy has been witnessed is because the options on the table are not palatable. Why will somebody come to eat when there's nothing tasty on the table, really, right? So Nigerians will express their will if their will is represented by the parties that are
I'm sorry to cut in, Hussein, but there is this issue also. If we're talking about, what is on the table, if it's edible, if it's palatable or not, it goes down to party politics, inter-party politics. Whether there be direct primaries or indirect primaries, the truth is the will of the people is somewhat cut off from that moment, because half the time we're just left with what the party offers us, and sometimes what the party offers us or the different political parties offer us is not necessarily our choice. So how do the people get involved from inside and within the parties before these people are being fielded as candidates in the first instance?
I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it's a question Nigerians are increasingly beginning to ask. Nigerians are increasingly aware that you're not going to change the country the day of the election, right? You're not going to change the country the year of the election. That you have to join political parties at your ward level where they organize, right? Most Nigerians, a lot of people who comment on Nigerian politics are unaware of the structure of Nigerian political parties. Now, I happen to understand quite intimately that it's a very difficult process to get your mind around how our Nigerian political parties work. I mean, I'm writing a PhD on the two main parties in Nigeria, and it's fairly difficult actually to come to grips with how they work, their history, their composition, etc., right? But I think the key point that has emerged of recent that Nigerians are beginning to pay more attention to is the fact that to actually have influence on a party, you have to be a member of that party from the ward level, right? And that entails that you vote in there to elect local representatives, that you vote to elect delegates who will elect party candidates at the primary stage. And if you're not doing that, if you're not involved at that stage, then really, I mean, you've already lost out, right? Because the options that come to you at the end will only be the options that have been chosen by people who might disagree with you, right?
Okay.
The truth is, if you take a look at elections almost globally, you never have the most perfect candidates. What usually happens is we are forced to settle for the best on offer. So sometimes you have a situation where probably the two candidates or the leading candidates are not exactly the best that we want. But we just have to settle for the one we think.
Talking about that, and sorry to button there, we have no less than 91 political parties in Nigeria. So are you trying to tell me that if you have a buffet now and you have 91 dishes, none of them seems, because we see all of these smaller parties, and you ask yourself, how much of an impact have they been able to wield? It seems Nigerians are not tired enough. At least if you're tired of Party A and Party B, then why don't you just test Party C and see possibly, maybe or maybe not, they'll be able to satisfy your interests. But we've seen poor numbers from the rest of the political parties. So at the end of the day, are we truly tired enough?
What puts a candidate in office, when you understand Nigerian politics, is not the candidate. It is the structure that follows the candidate. There are people in Okene, there are people in Potiskum, there are people who don't know who Atiku is, they don't know who Buhari is, but they know what PDP is. They have a ward office close to them. It is the party structure that drives the campaign process. It is the party structure that mobilizes. So a lot of the new parties, no matter how beautiful their candidates are, just don't have the structure to drive a national campaign. That's just the reality.
And talking about national campaigns and how we are supposed to be pushing that conversation, we have a package here on how violence also impacts on the decision to come out whether or not to vote.
We think it is important that the military restore its image and integrity by staying away from unnecessary intervention in our election. The amount of money we have seen into this election is quite too much, and we cannot continue to spend taxpayers' money and only to end up with this kind of kangaroo election that is happening in many places. Some places there is no election because of the hooliganism, because of some people desperation to retain or to take over power. We cannot continue that way.
There is impunity in terms of electoral offences. Over and over again, people commit the same offence, and nobody ever gets even charged, not to talk of being prosecuted. The present legal regime is a difficult one. INEC is supposed to prosecute electoral offences.
Different forms of threats, harassment, intimidation and assault were reported during the elections. We believe that these attempts are aimed at undermining the system, usually to favor the perpetrators. Our monitors on the ground did not only report cases of intimidation, but were victims themselves. One of our observers was arrested by soldiers in the Mile 2 area of Lagos on his way to cover the protest over non-payment of allowances by ad hoc staff. Political thugs slapped and abducted our observer in.
All right. So apparently that video is somewhat highlighting some of the ills or the negatives that we have recorded during the presidential and the gubernatorial elections. More like an outcry, asking security agencies and the necessary authorities to do something so that this doesn't repeat itself. Before me, like I said to somebody yesterday, I feel like we've been here before and we're still here again. And it would be really saddening if we're here again 2023 talking about the same issues. When are we going to grow past this? Or when are we going to make that decision that we're not going to do this again?
I would say, look, there are a number of things to bear in mind. You're right in the first place, and the video has correctly pointed out that these elections have not gone hitch-free. There have been incidents of violence across the country in almost every geopolitical zone. But it's also important to emphasize that the type of violence and the extent of violence appears to be reducing over time. And now, this is a point that lots of Nigerians might be shocked to hear. But the reality is that the level of casualties we're witnessing in this election cannot really be compared to what we saw, for instance, after the 2011 election, when in Kaduna State, upwards of 800 people were killed. Yeah. You understand? So, and keep in mind also that in previous elections in Nigerian history, we honestly feared that the country would either fall apart or that the military would seize power. These are not the conversations we're having this time around, and that is a mark of progress. Now, it's certainly not the kind of progress that Nigerians desire. We want to be on the moon, you know, and we are in an airplane, right? But we're not on the ground. And I think this is something that needs to be emphasized so that it can inspire Nigerians to actually act for more. Now, there were localized incidents of violence. I think in the next election, we need to see the security forces focus on those hotspots. And to some extent, they did that, right? To some extent, you saw massive deployment in certain states where we tend to expect violence. The truth is that given the difficulties, structural difficulties that this country is faced with, including high unemployment, including extreme levels of poverty, to get to a situation where you completely stamp out electoral malpractice or incidences of violence will be extremely difficult. I mean, I don't anticipate that that will happen in the next 4 years. Nonetheless, I think we need to pay more attention to the specifics, pay more attention to the localities, to the specific neighborhoods. For instance, Okota in Lagos. We witnessed that that neighborhood specifically had one incident of violence on the presidential election day. We witnessed Abonima in Rivers, one local government area. Kajuru and Kaduna. These specific local government areas, if our analysts, if our journalists, if our security forces can pay more strict attention to these areas rather than hyperboles about violence, then I think you'll see us moving somewhere. You know, if your car has an issue, you don't complain about the entire car. You go to the actual shock absorbers or the actual spark plugs and you replace those faulty components.
Okay, Boogie, in closing, what do you think we need to do to get us out of this mess and move us way above and beyond? Look at how Senegal made us look like jokers.
Like when he was talking, if we're going to have a honest discussion, we have to be realistic. There's just so much that the media can cover. The infractions in these elections, the irregularities were massive. They were on a massive scale, we must be honest. And it was a reflection of the failure of our institutions. The police, the New York Police Department says to protect and to serve. When is the Nigerian police going to understand that their responsibility is to protect and to serve? Look at INEC, you know, the INEC performance, in my opinion, it took us back from 2019, in all honesty, even though I excuse them and rather put more of the blame on the political class who get these things happening. We need individuals in government and in governance who understand that institutions will outlive human beings, and these institutions must be strengthened. We must have an INEC that is truly independent. We must have a police force that understands that our responsibility in society has to be devoid of sentiment, has to be devoid of partisanship. We must have an army that understands that our responsibility is to protect the citizen and not, flow with the whims and caprices of whoever pays them or whoever is in power. Basically, a leadership class that is committed to ensuring that institutions that would outlive every human being are strengthened and are established.
Most definitely, and it is inexcusable to be nonchalant. Therefore, we have to have conversations and take action right immediately, Marianne.
Of course it is. But you can join us via WhatsApp on our social media platforms also, which is on Twitter at +TV Africa. On Instagram, we're also at +TV Africa. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube page at +TV Africa. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue with the conversation. We want to thank our guests once again. Thank you very much, Saeed Hussaini. I hope I got it right. And of course, Boogie Okwemoy. Thank you very much for being here. We'll take a break. We'll be right back.